In the Alive Bible Study by Lifeway Women, you'll spend 5 weeks walking through the basic fundamental beliefs of the Christian faith. This is the perfect Bible study for a new or growing believer who wants to learn what it means to walk out your faith as a part of the body of Christ. Through this study, you'll understand the meaning and importance of historic Christian practices like baptism, prayer, worship, the Lord's Supper, tithing, missions, and more. Whether you go through this study with a friend or use it as an outreach tool in your community, you'll be challenged to endure and leave a legacy of faith behind. Learn more at lifeway.com/alive. That's lifeway.com/alive. This is the Marked Podcast from Lifeway Women. Each episode, we'll talk about what God is doing, how He has and is marking each of us. We're so glad you've joined us today. Hello and welcome to the Mark Podcast. I am your host, Elizabeth Heineman, and today is what we're calling the Avenger crossover episode for Lifeway Podcast, because we are bringing together some Lifeway podcasters from across different podcasts. So all of you have been on the Marked Podcast before, but I still want us to reintroduce ourselves to everybody and tell us about the podcast that you host. So Amanda, you're sitting right here, so you can start, and we'll kind of go in a circle.
Okay, great. I am Amanda Mejias, and I have the pleasure of being the Lifeway Girls brand specialist, and I also serve our women in student ministry here at Lifeway. But through that, get to host the podcast His Glory, Her Good, and we are just wrapping up our second season, and eager to jump into our third season next month. So,
yeah, and that's really a fun podcast. Y'all have the most fun merch and photos for your podcast. I love it.
We have some podcast merch jealousy.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Everyone else is like, where is our sweatshirt?
Why didn't we get swag?
Yes, exactly.
I know a guy or a girl.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, great.
Why is it not working?
You do know a guy.
I feel like, Lynley, you should have the most merch.
I know. I'm like, wait, why is this not happening? So you want me to take over here?
Yes.
I'm Lynley Mandrell. I co-host the Glass House podcast with my husband, Ben, who is the president of Lifeway. So I do not work for Lifeway, but just kind of volunteer through the podcast. And we reached ministry leaders and their wives, just kind of taking them through some of the hard parts of ministry. And we're kind of going to try to start turning it towards the positive parts as well, because we don't want it to be just a total discouragement, like, oh, you don't want to be in ministry, because there really are some great things. So we love hosting that and getting to highlight the good and the bad.
Yes. And your podcast is so helpful for people who are in ministry, but there are episodes, I would say not every episode is for you if you're not married and in ministry, but there are a lot of episodes that I've listened to and gotten a lot from. So it's one of those that I subscribe to, and I pick and choose my episodes just to be 100% transparent.
Oh, no, it's fine.
But so I would encourage listeners to check it out, even if you're not married or you're not in ministry with your spouse.
Yeah. We've heard that a lot, for people to even understand what their pastors are going through.
Yeah, that's true too. Okay, Angie, tell us about you.
Hey, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. This is super fun. So I am the manager of the Lifeway Podcast Network, which means I get to work with all three of you beautiful women on your shows. And it's really fun to kind of get to see behind the scenes of how things work and how you guys do things and all of the fun stuff. But I also have my own podcast called Let It Shine. It was called Chatology for many, many years, and then I just rebranded in the fall. And Lynley is one of my co-hosts this season. We should mention that. So the cool thing about Let It Shine is I actually have 4 co-hosts this season, and Lynley Mandrell is one of them. Whitney Capps, Lisa Whittle, and Tiffany Casey are all my co-hosts. And so we've all done about 4 episodes apiece on topics that are encouraging women to grow spiritually. And so it's fun, all around body, mind, spirit growth. Yeah. And I've loved it.
And I think Angie wins the prize for best podcast theme song.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. It's a Let It Shine, but it's like a really fun version of it.
Fun.
Angie,
Yes.
sing it for us.
It is
Yeah.
fun. This little light of mine, I'm
There it
gonna
is.
let it shine.
There it is.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
that's it. That's it.
So it helps.
fun.
Angie knows some people that can help her with that too.
I know
so
a guy.
Yeah.
Hey, your
do.
guy helped me with my song too. So
Yeah.
And he did
There you
Lynley's
go.
music too. He did the Glass House music. Not marked though. Marked has been
Marked
established.
was established, yes. And I don't even know who did our song, but it was picked long before I was co-host. So, okay. So Angie, you mentioned that you lead the Lifeway Podcast Network, and I would imagine that most of our listeners don't even realize that Lifeway has a whole network of podcasts. So tell us, what are some other podcasts from Lifeway that our listeners might want to know about?
Okay, well, obviously we know about Marked because we're all
Right,
listening here
right.
on Marked. The Glass House and His Glory, Her Good are awesome, and they are for really anyone serving in ministry. But some others that you might want to know about, and specifically for Marked listeners, I wonder if you guys know about the Karen Kingsbury podcast. So we had the privilege of partnering with Karen this year to create a new podcast. She's told a million stories. As you know, she's a very famous, well-known fiction writer, but she's never told her own story. So I have loved working with her and getting to hear her actual life story, how God has worked in her life. And it is fascinating. So am I presumptuous to say that we can link to it in the show notes?
No, we will link to it in the show notes. I already saw Erin typing it in over there.
Okay, amazing. So you want to know about Karen Kingsbury, but if any of you have people in your lives, or maybe you yourself are serving in student ministry, not only do we have His Glory, Her Good, which is for women serving in student ministry, but we have 2 other student ministry shows, the Student Ministry Podcast and Youth Ministry Booster. So check both of those out. They are fantastic, high energy, and coming from real thought leaders in student ministry world right here at Lifeway.
And we also have the Kids Ministry Podcast, which is also
Absolutely.
great for that too. And a lot of our brands of ongoing curriculum have a podcast. So that's also helpful, I think, if you're teaching Sunday school and you use those. And if you're parents, I think the Student Ministry Podcast and the Kids Ministry Podcast, even though they're directed towards ministry leaders, I've found that they also have a lot of just help for parents as they're navigating conversations with their kids.
I want to say too about Kids Ministry 101 is the podcast that you're referring to.
Yes.
And Chuck Peters and Jana Magruder host that. And guys, they are fantastic. So definitely check that out. If you are listening or if you are working in kids ministry, serving in any way as a volunteer or as a paid staff member, that show is created specifically for you. So check it out.
Yes. So you check out all of the Lifeway podcasts. You can probably just type like Lifeway podcast in your podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, and find a lot of them. So we have a
that's
lot of
exactly
great
right.
resources for you. Okay. So each of you, I would like to know if you have like a favorite episode, or if that's too much to ask because it's like your children, then maybe one that you just often think about that you recommend to others. We can start back with Amanda.
yeah. Okay. So it's really hard to pick just one, but I am pretty new into it as
Yes.
well. We are doing something every podcast season where we host who we call Aunt P, our residential Lifeway counselor. And so having her on talking about topics this past season, we talked about shame, and as like women, how we struggle with shame and how it often translates to our girls and their own struggle with shame. So I really love having like a counselor on that episode where we can talk about real things. And then that first season, we did an episode with her just talking about like, when do you need to go to counseling? It's just nice to have some expert about stuff. And so I really enjoy every episode we do with her.
Yeah, that's great. Aunt P.
Aunt P. We love Aunt P.
That's fun. I'll go. So like you, it was really hard to pick, and I've loved the ones with Steve Cuss because he's kind of our resident counselor, and
Yes.
he's super wise. He speaks on anxiety really well. He has a great accent. But if I have to pick a favorite, and one that has gone over really well, is our episode with Scott and Candace Fortenberry about mental health. And there on that episode, Candace admitted to being diagnosed with bipolar while in ministry, while serving as a pastor's wife. And they actually came and spoke at one of our One Lifeway, our all staff gatherings, and she had a line a mile long afterwards. And I could hear a few people saying, my mom has bipolar or something. And so I think she just really connected with people because she's the first person I've really heard be very, very honest about, man, I have bipolar and it's hard. And now she's talking about it with her son and how hard that is. So that was an episode that we hear a lot about.
Angie, what about you?
Well, I'm not saying this just because Lynley is sitting here, but I do want to say that one of my most recent episodes with Lynley on family habits was really, really good. And I'm only saying that, you guys know how it is. Like you put an episode out into the world and you're like, I think it's fine, but you don't really know until you get feedback. I got a lot of feedback on that one. And I think it's just because it was so practical. Like people need ideas for how to create these kinds of rhythms and habits into their family. And Lynley is kind of the queen of that. So we talked a lot about that and gave a lot of practical ideas, but also kind of the spiritual and deeper reasons behind it. So I loved it. It was one of my very favorites. I can't remember the episode number right now, but we can link to all of these in the show notes, right, Erin?
Yes, she gave a thumbs up.
Okay, awesome.
What about you, Elizabeth? What is your favorite marked episode?
Yeah.
That's a great question that I did not prepare to answer.
I knew you did.
However, we did have an episode recently that was the episodes that we were still thinking about from 2023. And I would say that's a great place to start because there are little snippets of conversation. And Erin actually helped us with that too. And our producer, Caleb, or not our producer, our editor, Caleb. I get everybody's titles mixed up. Caleb chimed in too. And so that was really fun to just kind of hear like what everybody's still thinking about. And some of them were the same, but a lot of them were like, no, this episode was the one that I still talk about or think about or comes up in conversation. And so I would start there. Since then, we have interviewed Dr. Gary Chapman, which I think was one of all of our like most memorable just because he is so kind and so gracious and had this long conversation with us about love languages. And he's so humble. And we're just like, like everyone knows about love languages. These are everywhere. And you like came up with that phrase. And he would just say something and be like, and I wrote a book on that. We're like, of course you did.
Yes. What's your love language?
You may have heard of
My love language.
Yeah, what's your love language?
I think I have a different one for giving and receiving. So, which Gary Chapman said was okay.
Interesting.
And possible.
Yeah.
He says it's okay.
Yes.
He wrote the book.
Yes. I think the one that I give is gift giving. And the one that I receive best is probably either acts of service or quality time. So, physical touch is way down there for me.
Note to self, I will not hug you.
I don't mind hugs. I'm not an initiator.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
I don't mind hugs. Like we have this joke. If you hug me once, that's enough for the day. Like sometimes people will give you a hug in the beginning and then when they're leaving, I'm like, there's no need for another hug. We've already done that.
Well, fun fact, my love language is physical touch. So high
Sorry,
five,
Amanda.
give me a hug anytime. I will feel
You want a
really
fist bump?
loved.
We can just do that.
Awesome.
I feel like there was one time one of the ministers at my church who I love dearly, it was one of his first Sundays, though, and he was very enthusiastic. And he had met me previously, so, like, I was his friend there. And he gave me high fives no less than 3 times that morning and was like, hey, Elizabeth, how's it going? And I was like, it is still the same as 10 minutes ago. And I finally just had to be like, hey, man, we've done this. We've done this 3 times this morning. We're good.
Yep.
Isn't there a Seinfeld episode about high fives?
Oh,
I don't know.
probably.
Yeah, it's about like an excessive high fiver. I remember.
I do feel like from my camp days, I have residual. Like, I was a high five person for about 3 months during every summer.
Yeah. I was just going to say, if you were in student ministry or kids ministry, you are a high fiver by nature.
Just
yeah.
do it.
That's great.
It's almost like a reflex of just like, hey, buddy, hand up. Okay. So what do you love about hosting a podcast?
So we kind of started this by saying we wanted to highlight the underdog pastor and not just go, we have had some big name people, and I say that with air quotes, and people that you would recognize, but some of my favorite episodes are highlighting people. I can think specifically of a family that was talking about their child with autism or a family who's talking about losing her mom to suicide. And so getting to know people and forming relationships with them that we probably would not have met otherwise has been really special to me. And the goal of it for me has been to continue on relationships with them. And so that has been fun and special because there are several who are going through a crisis situation that we met doing this podcast, and I've been able to kind of keep in contact with them pretty regularly and be praying with them and all that stuff. So that's been important to me because the loss of like not being a pastor's wife myself is like we lose not having those life-on-life relationships that I'm used to. And so this has been a good substitute for me of just, okay, there are still ways to minister to people, even as a host of a podcast, because they're still in the trenches and they're still needing prayer and lots of guidance and support. So that's been it for me.
Yeah. And you can be a safe place for them and like
Yes.
a third party outside voice. And I think that's really important.
That's what I've told them a lot of times.
Yeah.
I'm like, listen, if you knew what I knew about just all kinds of things,
Yes.
like I'm not going to tell your secrets. So like it's safe.
Yeah.
kind of thing.
That's awesome.
I can resonate so much with that. I feel like in my job is taking care of the underdog. Girls minister, women in student ministry.
Yes.
It's not a like overly popular, necessarily even position on a church staff. And so to be able to reach those
A lot
women,
of volunteer, I would think.
a lot of volunteers, a lot of moms who just like, well, guess I got to do this,
Yeah.
or else
Yeah.
no one will.
Right.
And to be able
Or they
to-
want to be with their kids in ministry.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So to be able to just to like have conversations and say like you've got value, you know, your issues are not just like some horrible thing, but like we're in it with you, and there's a sense of community that has found through the podcast already, which has been really sweet. And I love being able to say like if no one else is championing you, you can know that you're going to come to Lifeway Girls and find, or His Glory Her Good, and find people that are in your corner wanting to support you, equip you, train you, not as experts, but people who are doing it right alongside you.
Yeah. Love
That's
that.
cool.
Angie, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, very similar to what Amanda and Lynley have already said, but it's the responses. Like, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you put something out in the world and you don't exactly know how it's going to land. But when you hear back from someone and hear a story of literal life change, you know, just because of something that was said on the show, it unlocked something maybe mentally or emotionally for them that they had been searching for words around, but somehow heard something that clicked and just put them on a new trajectory. And so it's really shocking to me how people invite us into their lives, into their ears, you know, into their everyday moments of getting ready in the morning or out for their walk. You know, how many times I'm going on walks with people. It's too bad I don't get, you know, credit for all of those
don't get those steps.
Right?
But yeah, it's amazing that people invite us into those moments. Those of you who are listening right now, you know, inviting us into whatever you're doing at this moment. Maybe you're washing dishes or folding laundry or picking kids up from school, whatever it is. It's just a privilege to get to do life with these people, even though it's kind of virtual, I guess.
Yeah.
I love that. We did an episode in this season with our bosses. So we each brought our boss in, and it was a ton of fun. And so to ask my boss, Ben Trueblood, who is Director of Church Ministries here, just having a really honest conversation about like what does it look like to be partners in ministry. But we always end every episode asking a question to like look back. Usually we say like, what would you tell your 15-year-old self, or what would you say to yourself like going into ministry? But for this conversation, having men on the podcast, we said, both Ben and Corinne's boss, Chef, they both have daughters. And so the question that we used in that episode was, what would you say to your daughter if she came to you and says she wants to go into ministry? And the answers were amazing. Like, honestly, it's one of my favorite moments in all the podcasts, because they like had to take a step back and reflect and not just like give like the, you know, here's the up top answer, the shiny answer, but just like a really like vulnerable place. And I think you're right, Angie. We offer just a place of vulnerability. Like while someone is doing dishes, we're getting really real right now. And talking about honest things that I think that maybe we wouldn't have that conversation if we otherwise.
Yeah, I think selfishly, that is one of the things that I love about hosting a podcast is I get to have these conversations with so many people, both like you were saying, Lynley, like people that their names would be recognizable, but then also people that we're just like, hey, my friend's sister has this story and it's really cool, and I think it would resonate with your audience or whatever it is. And I think I love getting to have those conversations and also have them be public, like you were saying, Angie. Like, we're getting to invite people in to hear these things that they might not otherwise get to hear. On the Mark podcast, we talk about we're inviting them into the green room, like at one of our events, or into the writers conference with the authors. And I think that's so fun. I just know whenever I get to see like behind the scenes of anything, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Like a factory tour. I love a factory tour. Or like just kind of seeing behind the curtain, so to speak, of like what goes into a Bible study or what goes into. And I think it's helpful for people to both get to know and lead the Bible study that we're talking about, but then also to kind of see that the stars are just like us. And then I think it helps to just help us to all be like, we're all in this together and we're doing this and we're on the same team and you're part of this just as much as we are. And it also helps, I think, for people to trust what Lifeway is putting out, because they can see behind the scenes and they see the conversations that we've had. Sometimes we're very real about like, well, this was a debate about whether or not to include this. Let's talk about this. Or just hearing from Dr. Gary Chapman on the love languages and what that was like and why you should do a love languages Bible study, even though you've read the book and all of those things. So I think selfishly, it's that I don't hear a lot of feedback online for our podcast, but I hear about it when I go places like the Women's Forum or to SBC or TGC conferences, and I'm standing there and women will be like, your voice sounds so familiar. I'm like, oh, yes. Have you gotten that?
That was my first time, okay? Because again, we're so new. And I'm standing in an elevator at Youth Ministry Conclave in Chattanooga in January. I'm standing in an elevator, and this girl, I could just tell she keeps looking at me. And I just like, hanging out, I'm like, who knows? But later she comes up to the booth. She goes, okay, I thought it was you, but I didn't want to say anything. But then I heard your voice and I knew. I knew. She's like, I've been listening to your podcast. So it was so special.
Yeah.
There is somebody other than my mom listening to this.
I don't know if my mom listens to this.
I think my mom's done with ours.
So at least you have your mom listening.
Yeah, thanks, Mom.
No, we know we get to hear from people at conferences, and we tell them about the other podcast, and they're like, "Oh yes, I've listened to Glass House. I've listened to His Glory, Her Good." And so it's so fun to hear that, and like you were saying, Angie, it's such a privilege to be like invited into people's lives, but to get to have these conversations like with them. Even though they're kind of one-sided, because we don't hear their feedback, unfortunately, in real time. But it is fun to kind of see how we can be just a bright spot in their day, help them with these tough issues, Lynley, like you do, or to just be an encouragement and maybe make them laugh. And
love it.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so speaking of laughter, do you have any fun behind-the-scenes stories or conversations that didn't make it to air that you can share?
I think Angie will know what I'm talking about here. Honestly, I don't know if this is like funny or what, but I just remember we did our first like in-person podcast, like live. No, it wasn't our first round. Second round, but forum this past year. And we were like, we're going to record these podcasts, but it was like during the in-between.
There was a lot of noise.
So there was so much noise, and we have like me and Corinne sitting next to each other, and then across the way is the author, and I am so far from them. I'm constantly like, what'd you say? Like I'm like leading it as much as possible. I'll be like, I have no idea what they're saying, but I hope I respond correctly,
Yes.
So there has been those moments where you're like, I have no idea how this is going to turn out, but somehow they always make it work. So
yeah, we had that happen at a live event with Mary Margaret, and I could tell she couldn't hear her. So I just was like, all right, it's on me. We're going to host this. Yeah, but it was fun.
That's funny. So mine is less funny, but just conversation behind the scenes.
No,
I'm not really a funny person. I'll leave that to Ben. But last year at the Southern Baptist Convention, we interviewed a bunch of people in the Lifeway booth. And it has not yet been aired because we're deciding what to do. But we were interviewing all these people, and the very last question Ben asked all these women was, what does it feel like to be a woman in the SBC?
Oh, no.
And it was...
Your reaction was so visceral. I wish people could see.
See, that's why we haven't figured out what to do with it yet. But we are saving all this material and really praying on it because, again, we do not want to stir up. That's not the point of our podcast, is to stir up controversy. But it was very eye-opening, the responses. And there was a theme that went throughout all of them of almost like it's scary. It's scary to be a woman. And so I'm not going to stir up stuff on your podcast as well. But that was one that was behind the scenes that we're still trying to figure out what to do. And it was interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting for sure.
It sounds sometimes you're like, I ask a question and you're like, this is going to be so great. And then you're like, I don't know if I should have gone that far or.
Well, and they were all caught by surprise because they didn't know.
Sure.
Yeah,
I asked them that question.
And and Ben had to say to me, he said, say what you want to say. We'll let you know if we're ever going to air this beforehand. And so, and people know we edit our podcast because my mouth gets the best of me. Angie was there for that part.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. It is kind of funny because Ben got the idea, as he does, very spur of the moment. And he was just like, I have an idea. What's it like to be a woman in the SBC? And I think
you and I, Angie, both would kind of gasp ourselves. Like, are we asking this right now?
Amanda did.
Yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he didn't tell us he was going to do that.
That's
fun. So it was good. But I will say, when Lynley said we edit because of my mouth, so I edit the Glass House. But I know if Lynley says, we may need to edit this out.
You never take it out.
We're keeping that part. Whatever she's about to say is going to be podcasting gold. I'm keeping that in.
And Ben is nervous over there beside me. All right, tell your funny story, Angie.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a couple of things, just something behind the scenes, and I cannot mention this person's name, but I have only been stood up one time on my podcast.
No.
Like there are things that happen where you have a guest who doesn't show up and then you find out later they forgot and they apologize profusely or, things like that happen all the time, or they have to reschedule. But I got just plain stood up one time. And I wish I could tell you who it was, listeners, but I won't do that. But that was a hard thing to deal with as a podcaster. But I will tell you a funny thing. And, if you're watching any video of this right now, you could see Amanda and Lynley and Elizabeth sitting in the beautiful Lifeway podcast studio. But I am at home. I'm recording from Orlando, Florida, which is where I do a lot of my recording. And so oftentimes I will be in the house and recording, and my kids are like walking by me going, where are my keys? It's like people think that podcasting is like some kind of glamorous, like we've got it all professionally figured out. But most of the time I'm just thinking, how can I find a quiet spot to record?
Oh, listeners of the Mark podcast are fully aware that we are not professional and have, especially when we were recording at home. It was just like, we were talking the other day that Kelly, one episode, she goes, Vic is mowing the yard. Can you hear him? And I was like, yes.
That's
I can hear him.
Well, I was just thinking that right behind the cameras, there's a giant window that people, like just now, I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't even know she was in the office today. And immediately I'm like.
We have to be very focused on that. Yes. I think most of my fun behind the scenes things I've said already on the podcast from time to time, but one that came to mind, Angie, as you were talking was we often will have podcast guests. If we have them in studio, a lot of times they'll just hang out with us for like the next 30 minutes. And one that I wish we had kept recording, but we had no idea, was Eduardo, who was Edward, who was our podcast or our Operation Christmas Child guy who talked about the Operation Christmas Child shoeboxes. And he told some great stories about that. But once we stopped recording, he was telling us about his real life outside of Operation Christmas Child because he works there. But he was in the Olympics. He was on the and he's gonna go back and all this
really
stuff.
Cool.
And we were like, hey, you could maybe have told us this on the podcast.
Amazing.
And he had pastored a church as a young single man and just talking about the hardship that was and what but also the blessing that it was and we were just like, this is all so fascinating. We almost need to have you do a whole hour-long episode just about your life. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time for that day, but it was so interesting. So I think there are some fun conversations that happen after we turn the mics off. Unfortunately, sometimes sometimes we wouldn't want to publish those, but sometimes we're like, man, did you get all that, Donnie? That's what we always think. Okay. So this is the Marked podcast, even though you all have your own podcast. And Amanda, I love that y'all have the one question every week. So, our question every week is what has marked you in your walk with Christ? But we're going to go specific since you've all answered that question before. What about podcasting has marked you in your walk with Christ?
As someone who's like so new in this, my answer may be a little bit different, but I never signed up to do this. I never was like, you know what I want to do? Host a podcast. And so when my boss was like, hey, so I would like for you to start a podcast.
Other duties as assigned.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are you sure you've got the right girl? And I still, I think, struggle a lot with like imposter syndrome, but so much every time I have a conversation with somebody, whether it's Corinne or who's my co-host or a guest that we have on, it's every time I leave, I'm like, I don't even remember like what we said. And it's just a reminder of like how much like when we do ministry and when we are like, loving people even through a podcast, it's so much not about me. It's so much not about us and who we are or what we have to offer. And it's been really humbling to be like, yeah, I'm not on this because of who I am. I'm on this because the Lord has called me to be on this. And so
That's a good word.
Do you want me to go?
Yeah.
I don't know. Angie's always last, but not least.
It's fine.
I would say that podcasting has reminded me, the Bible talks so much about sorrow. And it's marked me in that everybody's going through some hard things.
Yeah.
When people say it all the time, there's all those cliches like of what people are going through. But it's so true. And so every guest we've interviewed, when we do speak to them ahead of time or afterwards, there's always something that they're grieving. And it has helped me to realize, like, sometimes I can get selfish and think, I've got something hard or something in my life is bad. And I'm not doing like the comparison game here. But I do think it's helpful for me to realize, it's just the world.
Yeah.
And I do think, this is so corny, but the older I get, I do realize, used to when I was younger and people were like, this is why we long for heaven. I was like, I'm not longing for heaven. Like, I just didn't understand that, like, especially in my 20s and early 30s. But as we get older and people grieve in different ways.
I'm 32 and I'm like, I get it now.
I'm starting.
Why are people obsessed with Revelation? I understand.
I'm like, all of a sudden I'm starting to realize it because it's hard. And as we get older and, even our kids, as they are, the second one's about to leave the nest and, dealing with bigger life issues, I'm like, man, it doesn't get easier. I thought it was going to get easier, but it's so emotionally hard. So I think it's just been so good for me to be in communication and relationship with people who are having to process other really, really hard things, to know, man, everybody's suffering in their own way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
I would even add, really similar to what Lynley is saying, I feel so inspired by the people that I get to interview. Before I was a podcaster, I was a podcast listener. And I would listen to episodes and just come away with these thoughts and ideas and listen to women talking about things that were super important to them or that they had thought really deeply about, or maybe how God had worked in their life. And I just felt challenged and inspired. Like, I want God to work in my life that way. And so that's really how I kind of carved out my podcast, was to begin having those conversations. And what you were saying, Lynley, it's like when you sit down in front of a microphone, the conversation just elevates, right? It's not like you're just sitting around a table privately, even though I do think private conversations have a lot of depth to them that you can't have in front of a microphone. But there's something about knowing this is going out that makes us dig a little bit deeper, go a little bit harder, find a little bit more depth that we wouldn't find in just a coffee shop conversation. And it just it's really helped me grow spiritually, honestly, just having these kinds of these quality conversations with women like you, with people who come on my show, and with the shows that I listen to. It just helps me grow. It makes me spiritually stronger. It makes me spiritually deeper. It makes me smarter.
Yeah, I agree. I think for me, it's like similar to what you said, Amanda. I didn't ask for this. The podcast was my idea, but it was not my idea to co-host. It took several years for me to co-host. And it's just one of those things that now is actually part of my job description, but was not for a very long time. And I think it's something that I also feel like I'm not good at this. And so I actually had a friend recently, she was like, you need to record this video. And I was like, I'm so bad on video.
Oh.
And she was like, I was like, I need to write down my thoughts. And she goes, you have a podcast. Yeah. And I was like, that is totally just Jesus
and my
coming
thoughts are
in.
written down.
Yeah. But she was like, you say things that are great all the time. And I was like, no, that's fully just Jesus. Because like you were saying, you hit stop or whatever, and you're like, what did we just talk about? I don't know. And so I think it is that reliance on God to use the things. I've always been a podcast listener, Angie. We have that in common. So kind of using my interest, but not necessarily my natural giftings, but in a way that brings glory to him, I hope. So his glory, my good,
yeah,
like your podcast title.
That's amen.
But yes, we hope that this podcast episode and podcasts in general, we hope that they are part of your life, listeners, not because of us and we want our voices in your ears, but because we do have some great conversations with brothers and sisters in Christ that we think are important for everybody to be a part of. And so that's why we do what we do. And we hope that you enjoy it. And we will have links in the show notes, thanks to our producer, Aaron, for all of these podcast links and podcast episodes. And we hope you will join us there or join us next week. Bye. Marked is a production of Lifeway Podcast. Produced by Aaron Franklin. It's recorded at the Lifeway Podcast Studios and engineered by Donnie Gordon. Edited by William Hall with art by Leanne Dan. And I'm your host, Elizabeth Heineman. Meet me back here next week. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can find us on social media at Lifeway Women. Today's show notes will be posted at lifewaywomen.com/marked. If you enjoy the show, leave us a review. It's hard to know a God we don't understand, and it's hard to love a God we don't know. But our God wants to be known and loved, and He's told us a lot about Himself in the pages of His Word, particularly that He is a three-in-one God. Although it is a crucial and classic Christian teaching, understanding the Trinity can be intimidating at first, but it doesn't have to be. Join best-selling author, Bible teacher, and podcaster Tara Lee Cobble as she walks you through the triune nature of God, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit in her new book, The Joy of the Trinity. As you turn each page, you'll discover a beautiful, foundational view of the Trinity that will not only inform how you relate to God, but give you a deeper intimacy and greater joy in knowing Him. Order your copy today wherever books are sold.